Marlon Brando didn't just gain weight, he built armor out of flesh, layering 400 pounds between himself and a world that had taken everything from him. His mother, alcoholic. His father, abusive. His son, murderer. His daughter, suicide. His career, compromised. His genius, wasted. Every pound was insulation. Every bite was numbing. Every meal was choosing obliteration over feeling. When Brando died at 400 pounds, barely able to breathe, he'd finally succeeded in making himself too big to be hurt anymore. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like the video for your support. Thank you for subscribing. The first wound was carved before Marlon Brando could speak, before he understood what alcohol was, or what it did to the people who needed it more than they needed their children. His mother, Dorothy Dodie Brando, was an alcoholic before it was called disease, before there was language for the way some people drink to drown themselves, before anyone understood that children of alcoholics spend their lives trying to make sense of love that comes and goes, depending on how many drinks their mother has had. Dodie was beautiful and talented and artistic, an actress herself, someone who had dreams before marriage and children, and the suffocating reality of being Mrs. Marlon Brando Sr. made her dreams impossible. She drank to cope, and her son Marlon, born April 3rd, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska, learned early that mothers were unreliable, that love was conditional on sobriety, that you could never quite trust that the person who held you would still be holding you tomorrow. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., was a different kind of poison. Where Dodie disappeared into bottles, Marlon Sr. was aggressively present, critical, demanding, contemptuous of anything he considered soft or weak or artistic. He was a salesman, a businessman, someone who measured worth in dollars and dominance, who looked at his sensitive, emotional, theatrical son and saw failure. Marlon Sr. was physically abusive in the casual way of men of his generation, who believed that beating children was called discipline, that making boys cry was called making them tough, that destroying your son's spirit was called raising him right. Young Marlon learned that fathers were dangerous, that masculinity meant cruelty, that showing emotion invited violence. Between the drunk mother and the abusive father, Marlon Brando learned the fundamental lesson that would shape everything that followed. People hurt you, connection is dangerous, and the only safe place is inside yourself, where no one else can reach. He became withdrawn, sullen, a problem child who acted out, because acting out was at least a form of control. If he was going to be hurt anyway, he might as well choose the terms. He was expelled from multiple schools, got in fights, stole things, rejected every attempt at discipline or structure. His father called him worthless. His mother, when she was sober enough to notice, cried over what her son was becoming. But what he was becoming was the inevitable result of what they had made him. A boy who trusted no one, needed no one, would rather destroy himself than let anyone else do it first. At 17, Marlon was sent to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota, his father's last attempt to beat the softness out of him, to make a man out of the sensitive, emotional boy who preferred reading and theater to business and discipline. It failed spectacularly. Marlon rebelled against every rule, mocked every authority, got expelled for insubordination and incorrigibility. His father saw it as confirmation that his son was hopeless. Marlon saw it as victory, proof that he couldn't be broken, couldn't be made to conform, couldn't be turned into his father, no matter how much violence was applied. In 1943, Marlon moved to New York City, following his sisters who had escaped to Manhattan and the art scene. His mother encouraged him, seeing in her son the artistic dreams she'd abandoned. She told him to study acting, and Marlon, who had spent his entire childhood performing different versions of himself to survive his parents, discovered that performance could be more than survival. It could be art. He enrolled in Erwin Piscator's dramatic workshop at the New School, and there he met Stella Adler, the teacher who would change his life and the future of American acting. Stella Adler taught the Stanislavski method, the revolutionary approach that demanded actors draw from their own emotional experiences, their own memories, their own pain to create authentic performances. For most students, method acting was a technique. For Marlon Brando, it was revelation. All the trauma he'd been carrying, the alcoholic mother, the abusive father, the years of emotional damage, suddenly had purpose. He could take his pain and transform it into art. He could use his wounds to create characters that felt more real than real life. The hurt that had been destroying him could now make him the greatest actor alive. His talent was immediately obvious to anyone watching. Marlon didn't act like other actors, reciting lines, hitting marks, performing emotion. He inhabited characters so completely that Marlon Brando disappeared. In class exercises, watching him was uncomfortable, intimate, like witnessing something private that shouldn't be public. He could access rage, vulnerability, sexuality, violence with an authenticity that made other students' work look like children's theater. Stella Adler recognized genius, dangerous, troubled genius, but genius nonetheless. In 1947, at age 23, Marlon Brando was cast as Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway. The role would make him famous, revolutionize American acting, and establish the archetype he would never quite escape: the brutish, sexual, dangerous man, barely containing violent impulses. Stanley Kowalski was everything Marlon Sr. had been: aggressive, masculine, threatening, but transformed through Marlon's genius into something more complex, a portrait of working-class rage and male vulnerability masked by brutality. The famous torn t-shirt, the raw sexuality, the way Marlon moved on stage like a caged animal. It wasn't costume or choreography. It was Marlon channeling his own fury at his father, his own confusion about masculinity, his own sense of being trapped in a world that demanded men be hard and cruel. When Stanley screamed, "Stella," and women in the audience gasped, they were responding to raw sexual power that theater had never seen before. Marlon Brando had brought his damaged self to the stage and made it magnetic. The role did something to him, though, or rather, it revealed something that had always been there. Playing Stanley required accessing his rage, his violence, the part of himself that could hurt people. And Marlon discovered that accessing those parts was easier than shutting them off. The line between character and self began to blur. Was he playing Stanley, or was Stanley who he really was underneath the performance of civilized behavior? Method acting had taught him to use his trauma, but it hadn't taught him how to protect himself from the trauma he was constantly reliving. In 1950, his mother died from alcohol-related illness. Dodie Brando had never stopped drinking, never recovered, never became the mother Marlon needed. She died having wasted her talent and destroyed her health, and Marlon was left with the complicated grief of mourning someone who had loved him but couldn't be present, who had given him life but couldn't quite manage to live her own. Her death was both loss and abandonment. Again, always again, the people who were supposed to stay kept leaving, and Marlon was left trying to understand why he wasn't enough to make them choose sobriety, presence, life. The film version of A Streetcar Named Desire came in 1951, directed by Elia Kazan, and Marlon's performance on screen was even more powerful than on stage. The camera captured things theater couldn't: the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his body language contradicted his words, the vulnerability underneath the violence. He was nominated for an Academy Award and became, overnight, the most famous actor in America and a sex symbol of almost absurd proportions. But being desired by millions didn't make Marlon feel less alone. If anything, it made loneliness more profound. All these people wanted Marlon Brando, the movie star, the sex symbol, the icon. No one wanted Marlon Brando, the person, the damaged son of alcoholic mother and abusive father, the man who didn't trust anyone and didn't know how to connect without hurting or being hurt. So he had affairs, lots of them, with women and men, with co-stars and strangers, seeking in sex what he couldn't find in intimacy. He was famously bisexual before Hollywood had language for it, sleeping with everyone from Marilyn Monroe to James Dean, collecting lovers like someone trying to prove they're desirable while never quite believing it. In 1957, Marlon married Anna Kashfi, a British actress. It was the first of 3 marriages, and it established a pattern. Marlon would commit to someone, have children with them, then slowly destroy the relationship through his inability to be faithful, present, or emotionally available. His first son, Christian Devi Brando, was born in 1958, and Marlon looked at this perfect child and felt terror. What if he became his father? What if the abuse and cruelty were hereditary? What if he hurt his son the way his father had hurt him? His solution was to be absent, which was its own form of abuse. Marlon threw himself into his career, into affairs, into buying a private island in Tahiti, Tetiaroa, where he could escape from responsibility and civilization itself. He told himself that absent was better than abusive, that his children were safer without him than with him. But children don't understand that logic. Children just know their father isn't there, doesn't call, doesn't visit, chooses everything else over them. The 1950s and early 1960s were Marlon's artistic peak. On the Waterfront, 1954, for which he won his first Oscar. The Wild One, 1953, which made him a rebel icon. Guys and Dolls, 1955. Sayonara, 1957. Each role showcased his genius, his ability to inhabit characters so completely that Marlon Brando disappeared. But each role also required him to access his trauma, to relive his pain, to open wounds that never quite healed between films. Method acting was making him the greatest actor alive and slowly destroying him from the inside. On the Waterfront's famous "I Could Have Been a Contender" scene wasn't acting. It was Marlon expressing his own sense of wasted potential, his own confusion about why being the best didn't make him happy, his own anguish about how talent couldn't fill the holes his parents had created. When he played Terry Malloy, a broken boxer who'd been used and discarded, Marlon was playing himself, someone who had all the tools for greatness but didn't know how to be a person, who could perform any emotion except authentic happiness. By the mid-1960s, Marlon's career was in decline. He was difficult on sets, fought with directors, made terrible choices about roles, gained weight that made him less viable as a leading man. He had proven he was the greatest actor alive, and it hadn't mattered. His mother was still dead. His father was still contemptuous. Marlon Sr. died in 1965 without ever acknowledging his son's genius. His children were growing up damaged by his absence, and Marlon was learning that you can win every award and still lose everything that matters. He turned to food the way his mother had turned to alcohol, compulsively, desperately, seeking in consumption what couldn't be found in connection. Eating was safer than feeling. Every bite was medication. Every meal was choosing numbness over pain. Marlon, who had been stunningly beautiful, who had represented the physical ideal of American masculinity, began to disappear under layers of flesh. By the late 1960s, he weighed 250 pounds. By the 1970s, 300. The weight wasn't vanity lost. It was armor constructed, insulation built between himself and a world that kept hurting him. In 1972, Francis Ford Coppola offered Marlon the role of Vito Corleone in The Godfather, a mafia don who controls through quiet power rather than physical violence. Marlon accepted, famously demanding absurd salary and profit participation, and delivered a performance that reminded the world why he'd been the greatest. But Vito Corleone was Marlon's father, powerful, controlling, emotionally distant, a man whose children feared and revered him. Playing his father was cathartic and traumatic, and Marlon won his second Oscar for showing the world exactly what it looks like when a man has all the power but no idea how to love. He refused to accept the Oscar, sending Native American activist Sachin Littlefeather to reject it as protest against Hollywood's treatment of indigenous peoples. It was vintage Brando, righteous, political, performative, and deeply committed to causes outside himself, because causes didn't require intimacy, didn't expect vulnerability, didn't abandon you when you failed to be enough. By the late 1970s, Marlon rarely worked, and when he did, he was openly contemptuous of the process. He refused to memorize lines, reading them off cue cards or sometimes his co-stars' foreheads. He demanded enormous sums of money for minimal work. He gained more weight, ate compulsively, turned his body into a prison from which he couldn't escape. People who had known him in his prime were shocked. How could the most beautiful man in Hollywood, the genius who'd revolutionized acting, become this? But Marlon knew exactly what he was doing. Every pound was a choice. Every meal was selecting obliteration over feeling. He was building a fortress, making himself physically too large to be hurt, too big to be vulnerable, too massive to be anything except powerful. If he was going to be a monster, the way his father had been a monster, the way Hollywood saw him as difficult and impossible, then he'd be a monster too big to be challenged, too enormous to be contained. His personal life was chaos. Multiple children with multiple women, none of whom he could fully commit to or be present for. Christian Brando grew up watching his father's affairs, his absence, his contempt for the world, and absorbed the lesson that men destroy things, that fathers abandon, that violence is how you express feeling when words aren't available. In 1990, Christian shot and killed Doug Drolet, the boyfriend of Marlon's daughter Cheyenne, in Marlon's own home. The reasons were murky. Christian claimed he was protecting Cheyenne from abuse. Others said it was cold-blooded murder. Either way, the result was the same. Marlon's son was a killer. The trial was anguish made public. Marlon testified, crying on the stand, begging the court to understand that Christian was a victim too, of Marlon's failed parenting, his absence, his inability to model functional masculinity or healthy relationships. He was confessing publicly what everyone who knew him already understood. Marlon Brando had destroyed his children through the same abandonment and emotional unavailability that had destroyed him. Christian was sentenced to 10 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter, and Marlon added more weight, more armor, more insulation against the unbearable knowledge that he had become his father, despite spending a lifetime trying not to. In 1995, his daughter Cheyenne, who had been pregnant by Drolet when Christian killed him, who had suffered a nervous breakdown and been hospitalized, who had lost custody of her child, hanged herself in Tahiti. She was 25 years old. Marlon had lost his daughter to the same despair that had killed his mother, the same inability to cope with trauma that ran through his family like genetic curse. The pattern was complete: alcoholic mother, abusive father, absent son, murderer grandson, suicide granddaughter. The Brando family destroyed itself across 3 generations, each one inheriting the wounds of the previous and finding new ways to bleed. After Cheyenne's death, Marlon retreated almost completely. He rarely left his house, saw few people, ate constantly. Food was his mother's alcohol, his own version of drinking oneself to death, except slower, more visible. The suicide taking decades instead of years. By 2000, Marlon Brando weighed nearly 400 pounds. His mobility was limited, his health was failing, his breathing was labored. The body that had once been a temple of masculine beauty was now a prison of flesh, each pound a brick in the wall he'd built between himself and feeling. People who managed to see him reported that his mind was still sharp, still brilliant, still capable of the insights and observations that had made him genius. But the genius was trapped in a failing body, and Marlon seemed almost at peace with it. This was the logical endpoint of a life spent building armor, spent choosing numbness over vulnerability, spent protecting himself from pain by making himself too big to be reached by anything except death. He gave interviews occasionally, and in them you could see flashes of the young Marlon, the intelligence, the anger, the refusal to conform. He spoke about Hollywood with contempt, about acting as lying for a living, about fame as prison. He spoke about his children with anguish, barely concealed beneath casual language. He spoke about everything except what mattered, that he was dying slowly from what he was eating, that the weight was killing him, that he'd spent 70 years building armor that had become a coffin. In 2004, at age 80, Marlon Brando died of respiratory failure, complicated by pulmonary fibrosis, congestive, heart failure, and obesity. His body, which had carried 400 pounds in his final years, simply gave out. The heart couldn't pump enough blood, the lungs couldn't process enough oxygen, the machine shut down from the weight it had been asked to carry. He died in a UCLA hospital, attended by some of his children, having lived long enough to bury 2 of them and watch the others struggle with the legacy he'd given them. Genius mixed with trauma, talent compromised by damage, love twisted into something that looked like abandonment. The obituaries focused on his acting, the revolution he'd started, the performances that remained definitive, the genius that had changed cinema. They mentioned the weight as sad footnote, as if the 400 pounds were separate from the genius rather than intimately connected to it, as if the man who ate himself to death and the man who'd been the greatest actor alive were 2 different people, rather than the same person employing different strategies for dealing with unbearable pain. But Marlon Brando's body was the most honest performance he ever gave. Every pound told a story of childhood trauma, of alcoholic mother and abusive father, of son who killed and daughter who died, of genius that couldn't save you from suffering, of method acting that required you to relive pain until you couldn't distinguish between the performance and the person anymore. The weight was armor and prison, protection and punishment, the physical manifestation of a man who had spent 80 years trying to make himself invulnerable and succeeded only in making himself unable to breathe. His children remember him differently, some with love, some with anger, all with the complicated grief of mourning someone who was present and absent simultaneously, who loved them but couldn't show it in ways that felt like love, who gave them DNA and damage in equal measure. Christian Brando, released from prison, struggled with addiction and died in 2008 at age 49, having never recovered from being his father's son. The other children scattered, some taking the Brando name and some fleeing from it, all carrying wounds that started in their grandfather's house and were inherited down through the generations like cursed heirlooms. Stella Adler, his acting teacher, once said that Marlon Brando was the most talented actor she ever taught and the most damaged person she ever met. The talent and the damage weren't coincidental. They were connected, 2 sides of the same coin. The trauma that made him a genius also made him unable to sustain relationships, unable to be a present father, unable to stop eating himself toward death. The method acting that revolutionized cinema required him to constantly access his worst memories, his deepest wounds, and you can't spend 50 years reliving your trauma without it destroying you. The alcoholic mother taught him that love disappears, that the people who are supposed to stay can't quite manage to be present, that you can need someone desperately and still be abandoned by them. Dodie Brando drank herself to death while her son was becoming famous, choosing alcohol over the child who loved her, and Marlon spent the rest of his life proving he didn't need anyone, that he could abandon first, that no one would ever leave him because he'd already gone. The abusive father taught him that masculinity meant cruelty, that showing emotion invited violence, that boys who cried were weaklings who deserved punishment. Marlon Sr. beat his son and called it discipline, mocked his artistic interests and called it toughening up, rejected every vulnerable part of his child and called it raising a man. Marlon spent his life trying not to be his father and became him anyway, distant, critical, absent, a man who destroyed his children through neglect while telling himself it was protection. The method acting that made him greatest also made him most vulnerable. Every role required him to open old wounds, access trauma, relive pain. Terry Malloy's regret in On the Waterfront, Stanley Kowalski's rage in A Streetcar Named Desire, Vito Corleone's cold control in The Godfather. These weren't performances, they were exorcisms, Marlon purging his demons for audiences who thought they were just watching good acting. But exorcism requires touching the demon, and Marlon touched his demons so often that they became familiar, comfortable, the only companions he trusted. The Wait was his final role, his last performance, the character he inhabited completely. Marlon Brando, as fortress, as giant, as man too big to hurt. Every meal was a line reading, every bite was blocking, every pound was costume. He directed himself in his own slow destruction, producing and starring in The Tragedy of Marlon Brando, a one-man show that lasted decades and ended with his death at 400 pounds, having successfully made himself invulnerable by making himself unable to live. Food was safer than people. Food didn't abandon you, didn't abuse you, didn't require emotional availability or vulnerability or trust. Food was reliable, consistent, always there when you needed it. Food didn't judge you, didn't expect you to be different, didn't leave you alone with your pain. Marlon Brando, who couldn't trust anyone, could trust food. And so he ate until he couldn't move easily, ate until his health failed, ate until eating was killing him, because dying slowly from food was still safer than living vulnerably with people. His friends from early days, Wally Cox, James Dean, Montgomery Clift, they'd all died young, all destroyed by the same Hollywood machine that made them famous, all casualties of talent that couldn't protect them from pain. Marlon outlived them by choosing a different kind of death, slower but no less certain, eating himself toward the grave instead of drinking or drugging himself there. The method was different, but the goal was the same: obliteration, escape, the numbing of feelings too. Intense to survive. In Tahiti, on his private island Tetiaroa, Marlon had built paradise: white sand beaches, crystal water, palm trees swaying in tropical breeze. He'd bought an island trying to escape the world, trying to find peace in isolation, trying to prove that he could be happy if only he could get away from people and their demands and expectations. But paradise was just another prison, another place to be alone with his thoughts, another location to perform the role of Marlon Brando, who didn't need anyone. The island couldn't save him because the problem wasn't location. It was inside him, had always been inside him, the wounds carved by alcoholic mother and abusive father, the damage compounded by absent fatherhood and dead children, the accumulation of trauma that no amount of genius or fame or money or beauty or islands could heal. You can't outrun yourself, and Marlon Brando spent 80 years trying. His last films were parodies, mumbling through lines he hadn't bothered to memorize, collecting enormous paychecks for minimal work, openly contemptuous of the process that had once meant everything to him. He'd shown the world that he was the greatest, and it hadn't mattered. They'd given him Oscars and acclaim and called him genius, and it hadn't filled the hole his mother's drinking had created, hadn't erased the bruises his father's fists had left, hadn't brought back his daughter, or saved his son, or made him capable of the connection he'd spent his life avoiding. When Marlon Brando died at 400 pounds, barely able to breathe, his body a monument to pain made physical, the world mourned the genius and ignored the tragedy. The obituaries listed his great roles, his revolutionary technique, his influence on generations of actors. They mentioned his eccentric later years and his health struggles, as if the weight were incidental rather than the entire point, as if the armor he'd built from flesh weren't the most honest thing he'd ever done. But the weight told the truth. His performances had been telling all along that trauma lives in the body, that pain finds physical form, that you can try to act your way out of suffering, but eventually the suffering writes itself on your flesh. Marlon Brando's 400-pound body was his final screenplay, his last character, the role he couldn't escape, no matter how good an actor he was. The damaged son of damaged parents, the absent father of destroyed children, the genius who revolutionized acting and couldn't figure out how to live, the man who spent 80 years building armor and died crushed under its weight. His legacy is contradictory and complex. He changed acting forever, made possible every naturalistic performance that came after, showed the world that truth in art required accessing truth in yourself. But he also showed the cost of that access, the price of constantly opening wounds for audience entertainment, the way genius and trauma dance together until you can't tell which is leading. Every great Brando performance was him bleeding for strangers, and eventually he ran out of blood. The greatest actor who ever lived died having never learned the most important thing. That armor protects you from connection, not from pain. That making yourself too big to hurt just makes you too big to live. That the wounds your parents give you can't be healed by winning Oscars or buying islands or eating until you disappear under your own flesh. That the only way out of trauma is through it, not around it, not numbed by food or alcohol or fame or sex or any of the medications we use to avoid feeling what needs to be felt. Marlon Brando was 400 pounds of pain, of unprocessed trauma, of grief turned inward, of rage swallowed down with every bite. He was his mother's alcoholism transformed into food addiction, his father's violence internalized and turned against himself, his own absent fatherhood made physical through the body that couldn't move to reach his children, even if he'd known how. He was method acting, taken to its logical conclusion, the ultimate inhabitation of character, except the character was his own destruction, and he stayed in role until it killed him. In the end, Marlon Brando proved that you can be the greatest in the world at what you do and still lose everything that matters. That talent is no immunity to suffering. That genius can't heal childhood wounds. That revolutionizing your art form doesn't mean you'll figure out how to live. He spent 80 years trying to make himself invulnerable through weight, through distance, through contempt, through performance. And what he discovered, what killed him, was that invulnerability is just another word for death, and armor built from flesh is still a prison. And when you spend your life eating to avoid feeling, eventually the eating kills you, and you never got to feel anything real anyway. 400 pounds of pain. That was Marlon Brando's final performance, his most honest role, his last act. Not Stanley Kowalski, or Vito Corleone, or Terry Malloy, but just Marlon, damaged, brilliant, broken, unable to stop building armor even as it suffocated him. He died as he'd lived, defended, distant, determined to prove he didn't need anyone, proving instead that humans can't survive without connection, no matter how thick the walls they build, no matter how many pounds of flesh they layer between themselves and the world, no matter how great they are at pretending to be someone else, when all they really needed was to learn how to be themselves.